there is no MSNBC or Fox for independents, right? They can. It's easier for them to figure out what their audiences are if they can say, well, you're a liberal, therefore you're going to want this, and you're a conservative, therefore you're going to want this. And frankly, as I'm so disappointed, I mean, CNN is now, in my mind, just a different version of MSNBC. I mean, where there used to be reporting that independently minded people could go for facts, that no longer exists. It does exist in newspapers, but on TV, forget it. I mean, maybe PBS NewsHour, but other than that, you're kind of cooked. So I think, and I worked for Huffington Post. Now I started a long-form investigative unit for Huffington Post, but I obviously was a part of the Huffington Post climate, and HuffPost was drilling into and appealing to progressives. So arguably, I suppose, I was part of the problem at one point. But the media loves it. The media loves the locking of horns, the horse race, bang up against each other kind of stuff.
And one of our challenges that you and I have talked about is that a lot of people, including active members of our media, think that if you're independent, you're for a third party. And I just want to dispel that myth today, because I'm not for a third party. Frankly, if you're disappointed in parties 1 and 2, why would you want 3, 4, or 5? So what I want is people to put their country above their party, that are in office or that pursue office. And so wherever you're coming from, and I want this clear too. If you're from a ruby red district, you may have to be a Republican. But for goodness sakes, for the country, be an independent Republican. Go on a reform agenda, a political reform agenda, and then stand up to the leadership of your party when you get there for what you believe. I did that. To be honest with you, and this is dangerous because he's got me on a camera right now, but this is a fact.
He's an owl.
I was the first Republican to call for Tom DeLay to step down, because I felt like, his motivation was party first and country second. And when they said, okay, he's resigned, how do you feel? I said, I feel like I've had a shower, because I want any partisan. And I was a partisan. I was president of the Young Republicans. I was chairman of the Republican Party. Partisan activity got me involved, so it can be very good. And the two-party system, in my opinion, served our country well for about 80 years. The last 20, it has not. It has simply not. And so what I would like to see independent candidates do is to hold the leadership of both parties more accountable. Absolutely. They shouldn't have duly elected members of the United States Congress spending 35 or 40% of their time raising money. They shouldn't put them in a booth and give them a list to call from. I've been there. I'm telling you, you have to do this if you want to advance. It is really wrong. It's called dialing for dollars, but it is gross now. When I left as a senior member of the Appropriations Committee, it's $200,000 a year. Outside of my own campaign, I had to find that money to give to the committee. That is now a factor of 3. It's $600,000 a cycle. There's people that are joining the Commerce Committee at the very bottom that have to give $440,000 a cycle. I was talking to a member last week from South Carolina, rural district in South Carolina. Been trying for 7 years to get on the Commerce Committee because of his district and his state. He said, how am I going to raise an extra $440,000 a cycle to stay on the Commerce Committee? Let me tell you what that leads to, y'all. It leads to shakedowns. It leads to corruption. Right. It leads to disconnection of the American people from their government. It leads to complete cynicism about all politicians are bad. Kim and I have 2 grown children. I don't want them to look down on the United States Congress. That is now commonplace. My first 10 years, I had congressional plates on my car. I got rid of them. I had the seal. I had the seal on my briefcase. I got rid of it. Honestly, it's like being a used car salesman today, because they've let standards, become low. And the chase is a 2-year chase. It's all about 2 years. It's all about winning elections. When $18 million come in from super PACs, from who knows who are these people? We want transparency. When a super PAC runs an ad, I want to see, who are these people? Is that the Koch brothers, or is that George Soros? Or who are the next 5 people down contributing? That's transparency. That's accountability. The American people are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. If you give them the right information, they will actually make a good choice. But they don't have the right information. As a matter of fact, today we have a real difficult time determining what is true and what is false. What is a lie? What is fake news? What is real news? The reason the president can say that is because there's actually a lot of fake news. In the world, there's a lot of fake news. And as a result, anything that he doesn't like, he can say fake news. And he actually can get away with it because there's fake news. We have got to get to the truth and the bottom of this. So that transcends both parties. And I know I've gone to preaching here. Part of this is defining the problem. Part of it is what are the solutions. Issue 1, which I'm proud to be a part of, is an outside group with a robust agenda of change and reform. And we're trying to get candidates across the country to adopt a reform agenda. We're going to stand for this, whether we're running as a Republican, whether we're running as a Democrat, whether we're running as an independent. Personally, I believe if you had about 12 independents in the U.S. House of Representatives, they would be more powerful than the Freedom Caucus. Think about it. Because the two parties are on parity and they're both in decline. They're really on parity. You can say, well, how does Trump maintain his base? I would equally say, how does Pelosi maintain her base? Yeah. They're both in decline. And they're the minority. Neither beats either in consecutive polls. Neither party beats either party. So I just think maybe our time is coming, and I'm not saying that everybody is going to run as an independent because that's not practical. But I think independents could run and win today that couldn't run and win before in certain places.
Let me ask you a question about this, because actually the very first time that we met was on a conference call, Nick, that you organized, that you generously invited me to come on to, where you were beginning to discuss this notion of creating an umbrella, not a party, right? Correct. But an umbrella agenda of reform in which independents, Democrats, and Republicans running for Congress would, hew to and campaign on a whole set of issues that grow out of wherever they are and the communities that they are representing, et cetera, and they would also carry a message about political reform and about restructuring the system. So could you give us like an update on where are things
Yeah, I
at
think
with
I want to
that?
call out Nick Thomas here in the second row, who's running as an independent in Colorado, and is a great guy and a real reformer. I think that in my mind, as a former journalist in DC, but also running issue 1 now, unless there is a clear agenda that independents are standing for, and I firmly believe that agenda has to be unrigging the system first and foremost. Step 1 is unrig the political system. Then I think that they just, to a lot of people, they look like independents for the sake of independence, in between for the sake of being in between, not believing in tribalism for the sake of maybe being peacemakers. And I think that that's maybe fine, but I think that most people want to know what the heck you're going to do on day 1 when you get into office. And unless there is clarity about what occurs on day 1 when you get into office and why you're running, I think that a lot of people will just default and say, I'm going to vote for the Democrat because I don't know what some independent person's talking about. So in our mind, we've got to, there could be an incredibly powerful movement starting in 2018 and going big in 2020 if we can get Republicans and independents and Democrats to all run on a fixed politics agenda, an unrig the system agenda. And that includes campaign finance, it includes gerrymandering, it includes ethics and transparency. And basically the message should be, we've got to fix the system so that we can fix other things, and that's step 1.
Yeah. And how big a factor, in your view, is the rise of the independent voter? One of the things I love in that clip, by the way, that we showed, is that when you say to Joe, 2 weeks ago, you said in the next 10 years, there's going to be an independent, viable presidential candidate, and his eyes kind of cross a little bit, and he gulps. Number 1, because you're bringing this up, and number 2, because you actually remembered something that he had said on the air previously. But this phenomena of people disaligning with the parties and looking elsewhere, so how does that, this is something that we engage with on a grassroots basis in our organizing all around the country. We see it every single day in all kinds of ways. And how do you see that growth and that phenomena and that?
It's going to continue. We got to remember why we are all in this room right now, which is that our current government is failing to solve our problems. The basic promise of a democracy, of the consent of the governed, is that we all come together, we pool our best wisdom, we debate the hell out of it, and then theoretically the best ideas get enacted. They win. That hasn't been occurring for a long time. There is the critique beneath that, in my mind, the first critique beneath that is that both parties have been bought and sold.
Absolutely. Yep.
I mean, would we all be here if we didn't believe that to some extent, right? So the first thing that Obama did when he decided he wanted to take on healthcare in America is he dispatched Rahm Emanuel to go have a meeting with Pharma, with Billy Townsend, one of Zach's former colleagues. And the first thing that they did was they said, we will exempt Pharma from any provisions in Obamacare as long as you support Obamacare with $150 million in advertising. Well, when the moment they did that, they took the major driver of healthcare costs off the table. So they basically said, we're not going to deal with cost issues in the healthcare system. And then, and you can just kind of like rewind that tape over and over again through financial reform. It was Bill Clinton who signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall, as we remember, right? All the way back. Neither one of these parties is solving problems right now. So unless independents can rise with that trenchant critique about the rigging of the system, the power of special interests, the dominance of money and influence making, and how, as a result, the best ideas are no longer viable in Washington, then I don't think that people are going to get the story. But I think that is the story that is slowly emerging. Ralph Nader tried this, right? And I'm not. Don't worry. I'm not. That's not an endorsement. But that's the critique that Nader came forward with. Is that his line was something like, the only difference between the Republicans and Democrats is how quickly their knees hit the door when the special interests walk through the door. Right. That's no longer a Nader line. 92% of the public in a Gallup poll a year ago, when asked whether or not members had more fealty to their donors or more fealty to their constituents, said their donors. So again, I think I just want to keep pushing this kind of money in politics, system is rigged message, because that's so critical.
We were talking before we came into the room about some of Zach's experience in the Gingrich Revolution, and I wanted to ask you guys some questions about this, because obviously the Gingrich Revolution was powered in part by the Perot Rebellion. And in 1992, of course, Perot ran and raised these issues. And what you had was a situation where Americans, from the most unlikely places, from middle America, the radical middle, was suddenly saying the things that Ralph Nader said a number of years later. One of the things that happened, which was really interesting and important, is that we were talking about Dr. Lenore Fulani and her independent run for the presidency in 1988, when she became the first woman and first African-American to get on the presidential ballot in the history of the U.S. And then over a number of years' time, we created a fusion between the Fulani movement and the Perot movement, and that led ultimately to the founding of the Reform Party. So all of this is going on in the independent world while you're getting elected to Congress, and people like Gingrich are figuring out that the point that you're making, which is that the populist dissatisfaction can be corralled in a certain kind of way, right, in that case for a Republican takeover of Congress. So I was wondering, I want to ask both of you this, but I want to ask if you would start, Zach, since you were inside of this. What did the Perot Revolution look like from inside the Gingrich Revolution?
Yeah, so I ran in 1992 against an 18-year incumbent Democrat, and I almost won, but I lost. So I was running when Perot was running. And a lot of those reforms were things that I embraced as a candidate. That's why in the class of 94, the 73 freshman Republicans, I was the most reform-minded. I was the one pushing for reforms and pushing the Gingrich class to kind of drain the swamp, to clean up the things that needed to be cleaned up. But I was somewhat of an outlier. One thing, combining your last question and this question, that I hope, and speaking of Nick Thomas sitting here, is that, historically, independent candidates have not gained the kind of support or attention that nominees from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party have, because the party apparatus allows candidates to emerge and to win primaries and win nominations, and independent candidates are almost were looked down on as not credible. Not, what I'd like to see today, since the two parties actually aren't credible. I mean, the two parties anymore can't really look you in the face and be honest with you, because they know, the leadership of the parties, that this is a rigged system. I mean, you may hate Trump, but Trump's right. It's a rigged system. And Trump captured about 6 key themes and won enough people to win the Electoral College. And one of those themes is, it's a rigged system and we're going to drain the swamp. Now, you can measure if anything's changed or not. That's a different question. But everybody knows that. And frankly, the party leadership knows that. The weirdest thing about the whole money chase to me is nobody likes it. I know Paul Ryan. He's actually a decent guy. He doesn't like it. I know Speaker Pelosi. We've had dinner in her home, Kim and I have. She doesn't like it. The people they call don't like it. The American public doesn't like it. And you think, how in the hell does this continue? And it continues because there's no courage. If quality independent candidates emerge, it's going to be a factor, and I think they'll be treated a lot more credibly today because they have more support among the American people. And so I think this is like kind of the chicken and the egg now. I think that if good independent candidates, I would like for people to emerge, maybe they served in the military, maybe they're young business people, and say, like Angus King says, because I mean, I know Angus King really well. He's a good friend of mine. He is actually the most independent person in the United States Congress. He is an independent from Maine. He was the governor of Maine as an independent. And the only reason that he caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate is because you can't get a committee assignment in the United States Senate or the United States House unless you affiliate with either party. Now, where in the heck in the Constitution is that mentioned? It's not. Independent candidates should be guaranteed by their country that if they run and win as an independent, they are seated and treated with the exact same prestige as people that belong to one of the two political parties. All of these things could happen. I'd like to see them happen, even to the point where members that are already there that don't really want to hide in the bosom of their party anymore might step out and say, if you don't push these reforms through, I'll join them. Because let me tell you, just the threat of that would cause these weak-kneed leaders of our political parties to cave. I swear. We're in 2018. The ground is shaking beneath their feet. The question is, how many candidates are going to emerge that have the audacity to say, I'm not going to drink your Kool-Aid?
But Zach, tell me, so let's say a guy like Nick Thomas gets elected as an independent from Colorado. What do you think the likelihood is that he would have to, in January of next year, signal to the Democrats or whoever, the Republicans, that he's going to caucus with one of them?
Right now,
how does he
100%. I think there's safety in
independence?
numbers, and I think the Supreme Court needs to be challenged. I think there's got to be a legal case made that he has standing, and that under the Constitution he has standing, and so somebody's got to break that ice.
That's an interesting idea.
But right now,
Thomas v. Congress.
But see, that's almost like bribery. You know, that if you want a committee assignment or you want a way to serve your district, you have to be one of us. Yeah. And then you're in the tribe. The question is, are you a full tribesman or not? And I understand the human desire to be in a tribe. But again, when it means you're going to sacrifice the very values that our country was built on, it's not a good thing.
Jackie, can I say one quick thing? Yeah. It's sort of funny playing into this. When I earlier got the question constantly, who are you going to caucus with? But who are you going to caucus with? But who are you going to caucus with? First I said no. Then you find other, and I've started answering it, the Reformers Caucus, which is sort of funny. And if you understand the political system, that's not a caucus. But boy, for 80-90% of people, they take that.
Well, on behalf of the people that set up the Reformers Caucus, I want to applaud you. You know, I don't know if you're going to win or not, but if more people would say the Reformers Caucus, then all of a sudden there's critical mass. Then there's accountability. There's some kind of leverage over the way things are. The status quo is hard to defeat. Status quo just continues right now. Most Americans have just given up on this, by the way. So I want to thank y'all all for not giving up. Honestly, you're here tonight because you're not going to give up. If we give up, we will then become, in a generation, the equivalent of a third world country. I mean, we might have some advantages left, but if we give up, no kidding. This form of government was created for a responsible electorate. People that pay attention, that make good decisions, that vote with knowledge. And if we don't have that, it doesn't work. There's too much freedom built into the system. Yeah. So we're just one generation from rapid decline if people give up on this. And a lot of people are giving up. It's sad, sad, sad. But that's the way I see it right now. And that's why I'm only in this for my children's generation. Now, you people say that. Honestly, I have no desire to serve anymore, but I want my kids and their children to think that public service is a noble calling and critical to the future of the United States of America.
Yeah. Well, these are what you're talking about here these are big ideas that go to the heart of the American experience, and I actually had a question I wanted to ask you, which is slightly odd, if I might. I know you're from a family of journalists. Your dad was the publisher of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which, by the way, I remember in the 1980s was a great paper and gave a lot of ink, actually, to independence and to the cause of independent candidates and so forth. So you have some great DNA.
Don't read the paper today; it'll break your heart.
Yeah, okay. It was sold. I understand.
Yes, exactly.
I know. By the way, your dad was Nick Penniman the fourth. Are you the fifth?
I am. We're horribly unoriginal with naming.
Okay. All right. That's not the odd question I was going to ask you. I read that you studied philosophy. Yeah, and I was wondering if you find it to be the case that having studied philosophy is useful in times such as these.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm only here because I'm not a terribly religious person, and in fact, I believe a lot in existentialism and existential philosophers like Heidegger and Nietzsche and Sartre and others. The basic premise of which is that life is somewhat of a blank slate. That we humans make up these stories about ourselves, and we make up these communities as we go. And so there are kind of two ways when you're an existentialist two reactions you can have. One is utter despair, and if you read Sartre's Nausea, that's basically a definition of existential despair. But the other is to try to find something meaningful on earth to apply yourself to that you can believe in. And honestly, the only durable thing that I feel like I can apply myself to that I can believe in is democracy, is the notion that whether you believe in a God or whether you don't, that we are all here to make sense of the world, and that democracy is not only how we make sense of it, but also how we nourish our souls and move the human community forward. So it is that process, that kind of, that system, as geeky as that sounds, of democracy, that's kind of my religion. I know that's corny, but that's the truth.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's a beautiful segue into another question or set of questions I wanted to talk to you about, and I wanted to show a clip to introduce this. But as everyone here, I'm sure, knows, this coming April, is the 50th anniversary of a great American tragedy, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And what I wanted to show you is a very, very short, just really a couple of lines from the last sermon that he preached at, I guess, the National Cathedral in Washington. This is at the very end of March 1968, shortly before he went down to Memphis. And I want to show you this clip and have us all look at it and then talk about some of the issues that he raises.
Visibly exhausted, King continued his campaign for the poor. Sunday, March 31st, he spoke at the National Cathedral in Washington.
This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The question is whether America will do it. There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
Whether we have the will. It seems like a profound question to raise, and this was 50 years ago, and we are where we are today. But obviously he's talking about many things here, but he's talking about the question of poverty, and he's talking about the will of America to address that. So would you share your thoughts about those
Yeah,
issues?
I'll start. And he speaks about the haves and the have-nots. So let me just say that I'm one of those. I said to Nick today, this whole thing is evolving of where we are at in America today, and it's changing every week. I mean, it's like, you know, who knows what the tweets will say tomorrow and where things are going, but it is very fluid. So you almost have to pay attention every day as to what's going on. Some of the latest beliefs that I have is that there's some groups that talk about, well, if everybody could just be centrist and work together from the middle out, things would get better. Because we've got the far right, the far left, well, maybe we need kind of a third movement from the middle. But I've been reading and believe now that there's not much in the middle that unites people, to be honest with you. People pretty much have their beliefs on right or left. And the only thing that really consensus is around, in my opinion, is economic anxiety in this country. And frankly, that's where, if you read the book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Trump tapped into economic anxiety from Louisiana to Ohio. And a whole lot of it was white middle-class people that have economic anxiety that had kind of gone unnoticed for 30 years. This person we met with here in town today has made a lot of money and said he thinks there's a great threat of stagflation and that there's economic anxiety and there's economic heartache ahead. That economic heartache is going to give rise to an independent movement. That's my prediction, because that's where you unite the left and the right around economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots. That is happening. I don't care if you're a hardcore conservative or an ultra-liberal. You can't deny the fact that there's this big divide today in this country and a shrinking middle class. And the pain points are all over the place. That is something we need to be real sensitive to. I think the will is kind of hidden. I think it's there. I really believe that we still have the right stuff in this country and that we have the ability to get through this like we got through the Great Depression, like we worked our way through the civil rights movement to a better approach. We're not anywhere near where we need to be, but I've seen us tested throughout history. So there's something in the DNA of the citizens of this country that the will is there. I think right now the populace just doesn't know what to do. And so I think with just a few people, I mean, Margaret Mead once said that she'd come to believe that a small group of dedicated and committed people could actually change the world. And then she said, in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. A small group of dedicated and committed people can actually change the world. You know, that's kind of an American notion, even though she wasn't American. I believe that we still have that will. I do. I just believe the people are desperately looking for leadership. I think they're so desperately looking for leadership that these two insurgents I talked about on Morning Joe actually took the momentum. Sanders and Trump. Who would have thunk that? I've been in politics all my adult life. I never would have dreamed. I ran Rubio's campaign in Tennessee. I thought this was kind of a Camelot moment for the Republican Party, that we'd reach into another generation, we would grab a Latino, and things would be transformed. That's what I believe. Didn't happen. This insurgent came from somewhere and took the Republican Party over. Bernie Sanders, Kim and I were in San Diego for a Sanders rally. We sat out on the sidewalk and said, look at these people. Who are these people? Where'd they come from? The will is still there, Jackie. There's excitement in the public of this country about change. Change is out there. The question is, who's going to harness it? Who's going to emerge? We have a vacuum. Man, Nick, young Americans could step in right now and really go a long way in American politics. You know why? Everybody else is afraid to be involved in it. There's a vacuum, but there's a country that wants change. They won't change so bad they're willing to take two big risks called Trump and Sanders. To me, that showed me they're ready for change. Those are big risks for Democratic and Republican voters.
Yeah, I think we, on the question of risk, the smartest articulation I heard from a Trump voter was my Uber driver in Boston a couple weeks ago. He was driving a Passat. He's probably in his early 60s, retired with a pension, maybe a union guy. And I said, "Who'd you vote for?" And he said, "You're not going to be happy with me." And I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Tell me, who'd you vote for?" He said, "Trump." And I said, "Why'd you vote for Trump?" And he said, "You know what?" He said, "Because the situation in Washington is so bad, I just wanted to send a kamikaze pilot into the whole and blow it up." And he said, "I know that's irresponsible, but that's where I am at this point." So that's also the opportunity for independent
That's right.
candidates to emerge.
That's
Because instead of engaging in a conscious act of nihilism, like he did, I mean, he said, "I don't know what's going to happen in the wake of this."
Yeah.
But instead of that, what we need is people who can smartly move forward and capture that guy's imagination. When it comes to the wealth divide issue, two quick things. Number one, the Forbes list just came out. The Forbes 500 list just came out last week. I did my own math on it. If you take the 15 wealthiest, and only one of them is non-American, Carlos Slim, the rest are Americans. 15 wealthiest collectively have a combined net worth of $1 trillion. 15 people, $1 trillion. I then went over to Oxfam because they do the best job of tracking global poverty. $1 trillion is more than the combined net worth of the poorest 5 billion people on Earth. 15 people, more net worth than 5 billion people on Earth. So at some point, that powder keg is going to light.
Yeah.
And if we don't get in front of it in this country, and as long as the middle class continues to decline, as long as the question that's being asked, that continues to tank, are your children's lives going to be better than yours or not? As you guys know, 3 years ago, for the first time in the history of this country, less than the majority said that their children's lives would be better. As long as that number goes down, something really dangerous is going to happen to this country. The two-party system is incapable of answering the questions or dealing with the question of how we reconstitute a functional middle class in this problem and how we solve poverty short of government expenditures, government programs. They're just incapable of it. There were two guys, fascinating study done, one at Princeton, I can't remember the other one. Their names are Page and Gillens. And they looked the last 40 years of public policy making, and they looked at public opinion polling on policy, and then they compared it to congressional outcomes, policies that actually passed through Congress. And the conclusion of their report was that, and this is a quote, that there was little or no correlation between policy outcomes and public opinion in America. So as long as you've got a system where public opinion's coming like this, and what comes out is like this,
Right.
that is the opportunity for what you all believe in, for this independent movement, to stand up and say it's time for this government to reflect the will of the people, for God's sake. But again, step one has got to be, as kind of cliche and corny as it is, it's got to be something around money and politics, something around de-rigging the system. Because unless you say you're going to do that first, I don't think anyone's going to believe that you're then going to be able to do the other stuff.
Okay. All right, well, let me open it up to the floor here, and we have time for a few questions here. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Jack. Good evening, gentlemen. I'm going to phrase this, I'm going to give you a magic wand. All citizens vote in all elections. It's the core of the reason I do the work that I do politically. What are the two things that each of you would do so that we can make that happen? I don't have to go in, especially in this.
So that all citizens vote?
All citizens vote, have the opportunity to vote
Yeah.
in all elections. I don't have to explain to people, especially in this room, about nonpartisan elections. What are the two things that you would do to make that happen?
Have the opportunity, meaning they're registered to vote?
Right. All citizens
Right.
have the opportunity
Yeah.
to vote in every single election. Go catch your request.
Yeah.
I would, if I could wave a magic wand over it, I would commission the Silicon Valley immediately to develop the technological capability for every American to vote online, secured, encrypted, no way to cheat, so that everyone has access to easy voting. Because we have the capability to do things electronically today that we've never had before, but nobody's taken the leadership on that. One thing I found out about Silicon Valley, and James, you'll like me saying this, is that the Silicon Valley and our private sector is capable of doing so many things that the government not only doesn't accept, they compete against it, of all things. So I would say to the Silicon Valley, show us the way, the path forward to do this in the virtual world so that every American can vote readily and guarantee that it's secure, and you're going to take the largest step towards universal voting in the modern age, because we're way behind on that.
Short of that, I do mail-in voting, so people can, they've got a 2-week or a 1-month window to vote. They can mail in whenever they want. If we inlet this blockchain stuff, which I'm not smart enough to understand, seems like it's the equivalent of mail-in, meaning that you could really verify. So if blockchain takes off, that might be it. But otherwise, mail-in voting. And then the other piece is that I do think you've got to. The number one reason why people don't vote is because they believe it doesn't matter. So that's why they're not registering. That's why they're not engaged, because they just feel like their voice no longer matters. So you've got to combine it with the system of, we'll unrig the system too.
Good question.
Yeah, Dr. Fields.
Thank you, Jackie and Zach and Nick, for this very important and interesting dialogue. So what I have been sitting here thinking about a lot is that the American people are really ahead of the elected officials.
Yes.
And you asked the question of, why does this corrupt system continue? Why does it continue? I think part of the reason it continues is because the American people have been locked out in many ways. But just the example of the Perot phenomenon, the election of Obama, Trump, how far Bernie Sanders got, everything you've been talking about is a demonstration of the readiness of the American people for a change.
That's right.
So for me, it seems to me that they're locked out because of the structure of our elections. The other question is, how do you bring people together on the ground? How do you actually bring diverse people from different communities together? So one of the ways that people are locked out in the African American community is the Democratic Party primary, which a small number of people vote in. The elected officials get elected. In the primary, the incumbency return rate is 98%. The community is not represented. Their voice is not heard. Poverty, mass incarceration, the tension between police and community, all these things, the failure of education, they're not addressed. So it seems to me that you have to empower the American people from all communities and bring people together. So there needs to be, I feel, some structural changes in order to do that, but you have to bring people together on the ground in all these different districts. And I feel like the thing that can really bring people together is real democracy. That's what people were voting for, a change in the corruption. When they voted for Obama and for Trump, and when people were voting for Bernie Sanders, they wanted to see some really fundamental changes. So I guess the issue that I'm raising is, I think democracy, empowerment, is something that can bring people together from all communities. And I think the primary system keeps out ordinary folks, black, white, Latino, across the board in our community. I think we have to change that.
It's like they have a lock on things. Otherwise, if you didn't have this two-party system where if you're in power, you just try to maintain power. If you're out of power, all you're trying to do is win power. And that really is the motivation. I hate to tell you this, and we can get purple just defining the problem. But I was there. I saw it. I mean, and again, Tom DeLay used to say the most important thing we can do for this country is to hold this majority. What kind of wrong-headed thinking is that? Just think about that. The majority, or the ability to govern, should be the benefit of doing the right thing, and not, selfishly, we just can hold power. Otherwise, you would open the whole thing up. I mean, one thing Jackie educated me on that, frankly, I had not followed a whole lot, is this patchwork quilt of how you actually can get on a ballot in America. Because every state is different, and in some states, it's really hard to get on the ballot. You got to have $5,000 or 5,000 signatures to get on the ballot, I think, in Pennsylvania. In Tennessee, it's 25 signatures, period. Period. No money, 25 signatures. Run for the highest office in the state. It's that easy. it ought to be that easy everywhere to run, number one. And there ought to be more of a universal code, a universal process to become a candidate in this country, where, like you're saying, we encourage them to vote, we encourage them to run, especially this next generation. Because I'm going to tell you, they're much more pragmatic than we are. They really don't want us arguing about issues that we've been arguing about for the last 50 years anymore, including social issues. They want us to just get on with running the trains on time. What the government is supposed to be there for. And so we've got to appeal to them and make it easier. And I always say neither party has an exclusive on integrity or ideas. And I do think the independent movement in this country can focus on that. The fact that neither party has an exclusive on integrity or ideas. There are people in this country that are brainwashed to think that the other party is like the enemy. I mean, how foolish is that, really? I mean, the enemy is our foreign adversaries that are trying to kill us or try to undermine our government. It's not domestically. These are just our opponents for ideas. But neither party has an exclusive, and neither party right now has much to brag about.
Yeah. Any other questions here? Harry?
Hi, Harry Kresge.
Hi.
Hi, Jerry.
Yeah, we had lunch.
Political reform activist, I guess forever, and I agree with everything that everyone's saying. And I was very touched that, glad that Jackie asked the philosophical question, and I love Nick's answer, and the poverty question, and then seeing Dr. King. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is that on some level, it's a moral question as to what we do together. And the big factor relative to the moral question is the whole issue of self-interest. And in my mind, at least, unless we can do something about that culturally and historically, these problems that we'd like to see solved isn't going to happen. So what's the connection, as you see it, between political reform, democracy, and transcending self-interest, which Americans did when they fought fascism and defeated slavery? Like, how do we bring that all together? And that's a hard question. And I'm not looking for
No, listen, I think in my lifetime, obviously, we saw it after 9/11. I know that also is kind of an overused talking point. But we did. There was a moment of great national coming together. It shouldn't take a miserable tragedy to create that. But I think that oftentimes it does when everything else is broken. And so, I wish I had it on me, but 7 years before the United States Constitution was ratified, John Adams and a couple other people, in a fit of about a month, wrote the state constitution for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And if you read, I think it's the maybe 7th or 8th paragraph, it says something the equivalent of, government is created for the common good and for the welfare and advancement of mankind. I need to edit that these days, obviously, but it was this lovely, poetic positing of the notion that the reason why they were doing all this stuff together was because of a love for each other and for humanity and the desire to advance the human community. So it's there. It's in our DNA. It's right there. And in fact, a lot of people, if you say, why was America founded? They always say life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Which is actually kind of selfish in a way. But what's the next sentence? The next sentence is, and to secure these rights, we will institute a government that is premised upon the consent of the governed. So, in that second sentence, the non-selfish one, is actually the more important part of the Declaration of Independence, because what it says is that the whole purpose, the whole deal here, step one, is we all got to come together and create a system that gives rise to our greatest hopes and dreams. And so it is in our DNA as Americans to do this, to join, to create that human community, that transcendent community. We just have to get back to that again.
Well, and it's a big philosophical question about selfishness in America because, you know, we're all, you know, the whole me generation type thing. And then you think back on the greatest generation and sacrifices that were made and kind of our posterity here, that's a big high level thing. But in terms of the selfishness of people in office today in Washington, D.C., the thing that attracts me to issue one is we now have 191 former members of Congress and governors in our coalition. And the one thing we have the ability to do collectively is to tell the truth. That this system is a rigged, incumbent-driven system. It is a selfish system to protect them in their positions. It is a rigged system. It is very hard to break through and penetrate. We are speaking out about solutions to that with the force of 191 former members, because those are the people that are like the conscience of the Congress and governors, that this is actually the truth. The people in there are not going to admit this because it's in their self-interest to hold that position. In a lot of cases, this is the best job they'll ever have. And that's sad but true. And the more sheep we have, because the parties run the show now, the more people are there that this is the best job they'll ever have. Because, somehow they got there, and as long as they are good little boys and girls, they get to stay there. And that's a self-interest thing that we have the ability to overcome. And there are some reforms now that are bubbling up at the state level that, if adopted on a federal level, could do away with pieces of this rigged system. Example, and I didn't even know this until Charlie Stenholm was on a call with us the other day from Texas, and he's going to be in Philadelphia tomorrow with us for this big convening that we have with John Meacham and Joseph Ellis, talking about the republic and what's necessary to sustain it going forward. And he said that in Texas there is a referendum this year that says if you're running for state or federal office in a 2-year cycle, if the referendum passes, no one can raise money or campaign, challengers or incumbents, for the first 9 months of a 2-year cycle, which limits the amount of money and limits the amount of campaigning and allows people that are in office to do their dadgum job instead of constantly campaigning. I hope that passes. In Tennessee, where I'm from, which is not exactly a progressive bastion, you cannot raise money while the legislature's in session from the second week of January until they get out in May. Guess what that allows? It allows people in office to work together without declaring enemies, to get things done without being distracted by special interest fundraisers every night or breaking away during the middle of the legislative day to go and make fundraising calls. These reforms at the state level could do great things in Washington. Just imagine if you could not raise money or campaign while the House or the Senate in Washington are in session. What a change in paradigm that would be. And does either party hurt worse than the other? No, it's the same. Now, one might be in a majority, one might be in a minority. But it's like non-proliferation in nuclear weapons. It's good for everybody if we would just declare détente, and how much is enough? Super PACs coming and going, and I mean, you ask about one single thing. I mean, Citizens United is just awful. I mean, candidates for office with super PACs now, because of Citizens United rulings, they have very little voice in the outcome of their own campaign. Yeah. That because somebody else declared Citizens for Good Government are going to run 15 times more ads than you can possibly run. So people that are running for office are marginalized. The special interests are empowered by these things. And so we have to fight for a new way to campaign, a new way to enter, a new way to serve. And the next generation deserves better than what we're giving them.
Yeah. Well, maybe we need to find a way, apropos of what Dr. Fields was saying, to get the money out and get the people in.
Right.
And that sets up a new paradigm, right?
That's right.
Yes.
A question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a existential psychotherapist, so
Oh.
you come in.
There you go.
But I grew up in different countries, in Europe and Latin America, and in this country, I'm aware that there isn't really a neutral organization that scores politicians in their work, in terms of finances, in terms of accomplishments, in terms of, people get a green card, people get a red card, those kinds of things that exist in other countries, we just don't have it here. We don't really see those things that basically tell you how are we grading our politicians. So when we don't have access to that kind of information, we vote by ideology. This is, I'm affiliated with this organization or with this party, and that's who I'm voting for. But I don't necessarily see a neutral organization that takes the place of informing me and educating me about what are the goals of this politician, whether he or she's able to accomplish those goals, or whether they're actually being hijacked by special groups. And in other countries, you see that, and you kind of review that, and you can make decisions based on what grading, whether you're from the left, whether you're from the right. But I guess there is a scoring card that you can actually see, and then make decisions based on that. But it is a neutral, it's an objective organization that is reputable, that you believe they're telling you the truth.
Which country are you referencing right now with that grading?
Does that.
Yeah, just say which ones. Right.
Mexico to some degree does that. Some of those countries do have a scoring card for those politicians.
That's a great idea. I mean, the NRA scores, as you know. The League of Conservation Voters scores based on environmental stuff, but no one scores based on governance.
Well, they've come and gone, though. Project Vote Smart was one that when I ran for office the first few cycles, they were totally neutral, and they just took your votes and your positions on the issues as candidates and as incumbents, and they gave it to you in an unvarnished way. One of the problems in the political reform movement today is there's 83 groups, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
They've done an inventory. There's 83 groups in the political reform space. 83, that's a lot of groups. Most of them have annual budgets of $500,000 or less. So, like he said, in the corporate world, that would be a need for like a roll-up. Let's get together, instead of having all these disparate groups going in all these different directions, just like a bunch of rabbits, when in fact we could have an army if we all got together and go more in the same direction. And these are the kind of ideas that you didn't have the power of a larger group. I mean, if you got all these little groups going in these directions, it's a fractured, splintered effort instead of a unified effort. Again, that's, I think, the challenge for us in this room is how can we pool the need and the knowledge in the same direction so that all these horses can actually make a difference together. That's a great idea, and I think, frankly, Vote Smart was one of those that came and went, probably overshadowed by all the individual special interests. And by the way, somebody said something earlier about Obamacare. Let me just say this, because it needs to be said. I voted against Obamacare, and not one Republican voted for it. Not one Democrat voted for this tax bill. The inconvenient truth, I'll tell you as a former member, is any legislation that is all one party is doomed.
Yep.
It's doomed. Because as soon as the other party's in power, they're going to try to dismantle it. And the fact is, there's a conscious thing of the American people. If nobody from the other party is going to support it, something's wrong. And you need to recognize that something's wrong. It's not like all the other party is stupid and all the one party is smart. This thing, why did the Tax Reform Act of 1986 last for 30 years? It was done in a bipartisan way. It lasted for 30 years because they all got together when Reagan and Tip O'Neill were together, and they got together and they hammered out their differences, and it was the policy for 30 years. We've got to do that again. What can the independent movement do to the country today? Be the conscious of the fact that if one party dominates, America loses. Either party. Yeah. And there's the integrity gap.
The one tool we do have is this, tomorrow in Philly, we're rolling out this thing called Declaration to Renew the Founding Promise. And it's been signed by 184, I think. Did we get
187 of the 191 members.
Former members of Congress and governors, 42% of whom are Republican, okay? So for candidates like Nick and others who want some distinction, they should, because we're going to be asking candidates to co-sign this thing. It's basically a pretty devastating critique of the current political system. And then it has solutions, including gerrymandering and money politics and other stuff.
We commit to do these things.
So anyone who says, I'm signing this thing along with these 204 members of Congress, and that's my creed, that allows them to stand out. And that at least gives the voters some way of understanding where they stand on the issue of political reform and change.
Whether they fulfill their promises.
Correct.
Exactly.
Correct.
Yeah.
Hold them accountable.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to wrap us up here and maybe just leave you with one final thought. The proper call for unifying all of the forces in the reform movement and the independent movement, critical issue. I think history tells us this, and I think this will be true here, that coalescence will happen when the American people demand it. And I think our job is to educate and organize the American people to place that demand on the leadership of the movement, which comes from many different places, many different orientations, many different choices of issues and priorities. But that's, I think, where we're going to. That's where the leadership for that unification is going to come from. And all right, hey, thank you guys
Thank you,
so
Jackie.
much for stopping by. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. And
By the way, we love New York.
okay, all right, you want to be invited back.